Well, welcome everybody to the presentation on communicating in uncertain times. This has been put on by the People's Interest Group, part of the Association for Project Management. I'm now going to just introduce you to our two speakers for today. The first is Anne Pilkington. She's a member of the People's SIG and author of Communicating Projects. Anne does an awful lot with communication and people within projects. The second speaker is Tim Lyons, again a member of the People's SIG. Tim is a very experienced program manager and is very interested in communicating and the methods and science behind communication. I'm now going to hand over to Anne so that she can start her presentation, and I look forward to hearing it all. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Ian, for that introduction, and welcome to everybody joining us today. Thanks so much for taking time out. And Tim and myself are delighted to be with you today to talk a bit about communication in what is quite an uncertain time for everybody, not just people working on projects. It's drawing on the content of a guide that we've put together to communication in normal times as well as uncertain times, and that will be coming out in the summer, I hope. So we've drawn on that and going to share some of the thoughts from that with you today, but also particularly putting a slant on it to think about the situation that many of us are operating in at the moment. So the thing I'd say, I think, is that for communication to be effective in uncertain times, we have to have done our groundwork. And I think those brands and organisations and projects that are doing well at the moment are probably those ones that already have a well thought through communication and strategy and plan in place. But that's not to say that you can't catch up and do some of that thinking and planning now. It may feel a bit counterintuitive when everything around us is changing to think about planning, but my view is planning doesn't have to be onerous when we're thinking about communication. It's just thinking about a few key principles and observing those at all times, and at times like this more than ever. And I think what I'd say is that the one thing we do need now is focused communication. So it should be comms with a focus, comms with an objective. Very often in the world of communications, which is my background, we can end up, if we're not careful, being what I call channel fillers. We've got a channel, for example, a newsletter, an intranet, something like that, and we've got to create content to fill it. But actually we need to turn that on its head, and what we need to be thinking about is what we want to achieve, and then what channels we need to help us achieve that, what content and what stakeholders we need to be talking with. So let's have a look briefly at a planning model. Now, the organisation that you're working in may have an agreed way of doing communications planning, and there are certainly plenty of planning models out there. I've drawn on this one because it's one that we use in my business, PR Academy. It was developed by Dr. Kevin Ruck, who's actually my husband, so I feel I should use it. But you'll see that any good strategic communication planning should start with research. What's the situation? What do we know? Who's affected? What do we know about those groups that are affected? So we've got to know where we're starting from, and we use that knowledge to inform our objectives and decide what to do. Then we need to decide how we're going to apply communication theory, and Tim will touch on some of this a bit later on, where he talks about the way that we like to communicate and principles of communication. We need to set out objectives, we need to implement the plan that's going to deliver those objectives, and really, really importantly, we need to measure against those objectives. We need to check how it's going and change track if we need to. And I do apologise, my slides seem to be jumping on, they've developed a mind of their own. So I just wanted to unpick and focus on a couple of bits from strategic communications planning that I think are really, really relevant and important. And the first one I wanted to talk about is objectives. Now, many of us will be familiar with the concept of SMART objectives. Some may feel that perhaps the concept's a little bit old hat, and certainly in terms of being measurable, sometimes with communication, if we're using qualitative measures, that can be a little bit tricky. But nevertheless, setting good objectives is really, really key to effective communication. So we should be clear about who we're talking to, we should be specific, we should be able to measure what we've done, what we do should be achievable, let's not set ourselves up to fail, and particularly importantly, a communication objective should be relevant to the project. You know, communications shouldn't be being done in isolation, it should be relevant to the project. And we need to set a time limit on it. By when are you going to achieve what it is you said you'll achieve? But there's a couple of things that I'd overlay on top of that. And one is that communication objectives should be focused on outcomes. What do we want our stakeholders to think, feel, or do? Now, having an objective around the number of newsletters, the number of events, the number of one-to-one conversations with stakeholders, if that's good, I would think of those as KPIs because they're things that are going to get you towards your end outcome objective. So our comms objectives should always be about outcomes. The second thing is that they should be about communication. Now, I know that sounds a bit mad because obviously a communication objective should be about communication. But it's surprising actually when I see objectives produced by the students that I work with who are studying communication, how often it's easy to slip to an objective that is about something that communication itself can't achieve. So, for example, in this objective here, which my slide pack keeps seeming to want to jump onto, you can see it's very specific, it's clear who we're talking to, and it's time-based, all those good, smart things. But you can see that it's about communication. It's about encouraging this group of people to know the benefits of taking more exercise. Because communication alone couldn't necessarily make people take more exercise. There may be all sorts of blockers. Their line manager might not want them to go out and take more exercise. There may be nowhere to do it. So it's important that our communications objectives are about what communication can achieve. And that's what we mean by an outcome objective that's communication focused. And all our activity in communication should be aligned. I call it the golden thread of strategic communication planning. Actually, in this example, it's purple, but it really needs to be golden. And that means that what we do should be there to deliver our objectives, and it should be right for the stakeholder group that we've identified. And we'll talk about stakeholders in a second. Because there's no good thinking you've got an objective to do one thing and you've got a group of stakeholders identified, but then choose a tactic that doesn't really help you to deliver it. So we need this kind of golden thread all the way through our communication planning to make sure that we are meeting the objectives that we've set. So let's look now in a little bit more detail at stakeholders specifically. Who are our stakeholders? And this, I think, in the times that we're working at the moment, is really, really important. And as I say, if we've done our groundwork, we already know who the stakeholders are that we want to be talking to. We understand them. We should be being clear about who owns the stakeholder relationship, who's on point, who's matched with that stakeholder. So if we need to communicate with them quickly or particularly in depth, who's going to do that? How's that relationship owned? How's it working? Also importantly, we should be clear about the channel. So we should have what I would call a channel strategy. Now, a channel strategy simply sets out all the different ways, all the routes that we've got to our stakeholders and what type of content goes into those channels. And I'll give you an example of why this is so important. And once again, I do apologise, my slides seem to be jumping on here. I worked on a project once where we were reorganising the project and quite a few people were on the bench and there was a lot of uncertainty within the project. And we used the project, or actually programme director's email channel to give people updates about what was happening. So everything that came through that channel was considered to be quite important. People would open the email and they would read it. But one day the program director asked me to put something in about a carol concert that was happening in the organisation. And that was actually the wrong type of content for that channel, because it would have undermined the channel, something that people had thought they must open because it was important and it was about the program reorganisation, suddenly had a complete different type of content in it and would have undermined their confidence in that channel. So it's important when we think about our stakeholders that we do have a channel strategy in place, so the stakeholders know what sort of information they're going to get and when. The other thing when thinking about stakeholders is that we must remember that this is about listening, just not just about talking. And at PR Academy, we've done some research about listening in organisations. And while this is very much about employees specifically, I think there's a lot of resonance with projects more generally. Now, some of the blockers that have come up to listening, I've got here, and one of them is thinking about leadership. You know, does your project or program leadership think that they always have to provide the answers rather than being in listening mode? So it's a different way of thinking about leadership. Also, we found when we did this research, there's often underinvestment in capability around listening. So that's something that we need to think about as well. There may be cultural barriers to listening. Sometimes employees, and in the context we're talking today, other stakeholders may be fearful of speaking out. Now, the final one here is one I just wanted to sort of think about for a moment or two, this idea of structures and processes. Because often with stakeholders, we've moved away from talking about management to talking about engagement. And that's absolutely right. Listening is having a two-way dialogue. It's really, really important that we're listening to stakeholders, not just talking at them. But actually, I would argue that this is where we do need some management, but it's management of the process, not management of the stakeholder. Because we need channels in place to capture feedback, particularly now more than ever when we need to understand what's worrying and concerning our stakeholders. We need a process for capturing that and a process for feeding back to our stakeholders how their own feedback has been taken on board, and if not, why not? So there really needs to be management around listening for the project or programme. Also thinking about stakeholders, now more than ever, when people are concerned, when things are changing and uncertain, it's not a time for unbridled positivity. So those of you who are old enough to remember the Spice Girls, I don't know if they invented this word, I think they probably did. But this isn't a time for being, you know, relentlessly positive and kind of selling and being very sort of excited and enthusiastic about what's going to be achieved. This is a time when people want good information, they want trusted channels and trusted sources. And there's a link here on the slides, which when we share the slides after, to an article that I wrote some time ago with a business change colleague on that topic. And if we move on to look at a couple of models around emergency and crisis communication, we'll see that nowhere in this model, the CIRC Lifecycle model, is there any talk about that kind of relentless positivity. And so I wanted to pick out one or two things here and focus on them particularly. Now, for many running projects, we won't necessarily be in a crisis situation, but I think nevertheless, this model has some things that we can draw from to inform how we tackle communication in this time of uncertainty. So you'll see right at the start in that pre-crisis or pre-emergency section, be prepared, foster alliances, just as we've been talking about, you know, having a good communication strategy and plan in place and establish stakeholder relationships really, really helps. In that early stage, it's about making sure that you've got a credible spokesperson. One thing I've noticed actually on the coronavirus outbreak is how there's always a different central spokesperson at their daily press conferences. And I'm sure they're doing that to illustrate that there's a whole team running this. I myself actually quite like the idea of somebody taking kind of centre stage who builds up that kind of credibility. Commitment to continue communication. Again, this is sort of part of that channel strategy. So your stakeholders not only know where to get information and what sort of information they can expect, but they also know when to expect it. And again, in that maintenance section, listening comes into place as being really, really important. Listening to stakeholder feedback, correcting misinformation, again, really, really important. And listening sounds really easy, but I think, again, it's about having good processes and management in place to enable that listening to happen. And this is a nice simple model. Again, it's about crisis communication, but I think it's the same when things are rapidly changing. And in crisis comms, we often talk about the first, fast and frequent, and that takes some saying, bit of a tongue twister. But being first, communicating quickly and doing it frequently is really, really important. Don't let others fill the space. You know, your stakeholders want to hear from you first, and they want that to be frequent and consistent. But let's not sacrifice accuracy for speed. It's absolutely fine to say that we don't know, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. The model also talks about a trusted source, and we've touched on this, and this is where our channel strategy comes back into play. So stakeholders knowing, again, what channel they're going to receive updates through, so they learn to trust it and understand it. We need to be using simple language, and Tim will talk a bit about that in a second or two. And obviously we need to keep adjusting our information as we go, and that's going to partly come through the feedback, through listening to stakeholders. Are they getting information in the right way? Is there anything that we're missing out? And again, all about two-way. This is much about listening to stakeholders as it is about talking to them. So one thing I just wanted to finally touch on is the issue of ambiguity. Now, this is something we're very, very used to dealing with in the project environment, because we don't always necessarily know what our projects are going to look like at the end of the day. Change is a kind of constant, really. And that's easier for some stakeholders to deal with than others. And I think the way to deal with ambiguity, this kind of not quite knowing, is to signpost. Hence my lovely picture here of the signpost on the Ridgeway Path in central southern England. But if we don't know, it's fine to say we don't know, but we need to explain why we don't know and what we're going to do to get to the answer. So it's about signposting. So it doesn't look like there's a void which people will just fill with their own speculation. It's about saying, well, we don't know just yet. This is why we don't know, and this is what we're doing to get to the answer. So those are my sort of top tips really around communicating in these uncertain times. I hope that's been useful. There's going to be lots more in the guide that we're producing. And I'm now going to hand over to Tim to take those ideas about different kinds of language and the way we communicate forward. So I'm handing over to Tim. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Anne. That was a really good and insightful canter through setting up a communications plan, looking at channel strategy and so on. It's from that point, I wanted to take you into some of the mechanics of how we communicate as animals, really. And so I wanted to just go on from there to look at some of the aspects of communication from a mechanical point of view, if you like. So having set up our idea of our communication plan, we designed it, we've thought about our audiences and so on, we're ready to engage. Well, this is the point where I think it's really important to stress what Anne was saying about listening, because we have to listen from the point of view of understanding rather than from what Stephen Covey has said, is that most people listen from the point of view of being ready to respond and reply. We should be listening to understand. Having understood what we think we're hearing from people, because communication is partly to do with listening as well, we must adjust our message if we need to, so that we're hitting the right audience, getting the right points across, making sure that our message is going to be understood by the audience, really, and then we communicate. And it's a cycle. So we go through that cycle. If we follow that, we will be more likely to hit the spot. So before going any further, I just wanted to read to you three statements, and I'd like you to just listen to them and just think about what they mean to you. They're pretty much saying the same thing in a project context, and I'll just count them in. So 1, I want to show you how the new project reporting looks, see what you think, and then we'll take a view on how we can put it up on the intranet. 2, I'd like to talk with you about the new stakeholder pack. How does that sound? If we agree, we can put the word out. 3, we should get together on the board's new reporting requirements. I've put together some ideas and want to see if they feel right to you so we can take them forward. So we've got about 100 people on board today. What we've just done is said pretty much the same thing in 3 different ways. Statistically, it's probably right that about 45 people today construct their world through a visual metaphor. So if you're one of those people, you see things first, you use language like, what does good look like? You see what I mean, or show me something. If you're auditory, which is the second group, the smallest group really, you would be more likely to say, that sounds about right, or would you say that if you were asking somebody something? Or you might say, let's discuss this or that. If you are the third group, or a member of the third group, what we call the kinesthetic group, which is 40%-ish, so 40 people today with any luck, you would be using language like, does that feel about right? Let's go on a journey. Or you might say something like, in the first place or the second place. So each group typically uses that metaphor, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, to construct their view of the world. And that means that they represent the world in those terms. So although it's not a hard and fast rule, it's pretty much a fairly good proportion. So how do we use this in a communication context? Using it in practice. Well, you have to try and observe the patterns people are using. That's not easy if you're doing a broadcast or a communications plan that goes to many. But whether it's written or spoken, you will get cues from people. You should try and respond in the same representational system, their primary representational system, if you want to get deep into their understanding. And if you do that, the chances are your interaction with them will work better. So on a one-to-one basis, here's a sort of a clue as to how it might work. What a tip I often use is if I'm hearing somebody for the first time in a discussion, I will write down, as I listen to their words, the letters V, A, and K for visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. And when I hear them say something like, would you say that's right? I write down A for auditory. Or when I hear them say, in the first place, we've got this, then I'm writing down K for kinesthetic, because they are thinking in terms of a place, a physical movement. And when you've written that down over a period of 5 minutes or something, however long they're talking, you'll find you've got a string of VAKs and lots of different patterns emerging from that. Well, what you will find is that one pattern dominates. You'll find that people are primarily going to use, say, visual. 45% of people would use visual. So that means that when you communicate with that person, it's easier to get to them if you're using visual language. So again, I can't go into it too much in a short webinar like that. But basically, if you consider that you are one person and there are 2 other people in the world who are different from you, and understanding how to communicate with them involves an understanding of how they put their world together, whether they be auditory, visual, or kinesthetic. Some patterns, some groups, sometimes if they're not communicating very well, it's often because they're not using the same kind of language. The worst case probably is visual and kinesthetic. These are basically two people who are put on this earth to drive each other stark raving mad because they've never used the same language. But understanding that people do have these different ways of putting the world together will help you when you communicate with them. So obviously in our situation at the moment where we're all working from home with lockdown mode, understanding that you may have to think about how the other person reads what you're saying will help you. So that's primary representation of systems. We can use them to our advantage. The second thing I wanted to talk to you about was using perceptual positions. Now, there are basically 3 perceptual positions. There are 4, but I'll talk to you about the 3 main ones. The first position is me, what I call me, myself, I. It's me talking to you. I've got something to say, so I'm going to talk to you. Why wouldn't I? That's the whole point of communication, isn't it? Or is it? For listening as well, of course. So the first position is me telling you something. The second position, and they are genuinely called first and second positions, so it's not difficult to understand, is where you're kind of what we call walking in somebody's shoes. How is my message being received? One of the precepts of a particular study of communication that I have adopted is which is, by the way, called neuro-linguistic programming, if anyone has come across this, is that one of the precepts of NLP, as we call it, is that the value of a communication, any communication, is simply the meaning that is received by the person at the other end, the meaning of the received message. So understanding how someone will read your message is as important a part of the communication as what you are saying. The third position, the third main position in perceptual positions, is what we call fly on the wall, which is, in a simple situation, it would be you're hearing 2 people talking with each other, having a discussion, and you are the third party, and you're hearing what one is saying, what the other is saying when they reply, and so on and so on. And you will get an idea from that how well the communication is going or how badly. The third position also is useful where you, whether you're in first position or whether you're the listener in second position, where you're referring to a third party, if you like, a third position. Like, for example, if you're referring to, I mentioned Stephen Covey a few minutes ago. Stephen Covey's writings in his great book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. If you're referring to somebody else's studies or work or position or view, you are taking a third position if you're referring to that. So how do you use this in practice? Well, saying something in a conversation with somebody like, well, you might well ask, why is it like this? Or asking for an audience response if you're sitting in a group, shows good use of second position. You're kind of pausing your broadcast and saying, right, well, let's hear what you've got to say. And that's always a good point because it means that you aren't coming across as just being, brash and single-minded. If you were to take a fairly neutral stance in a discussion with one or more people, and it might be a polarized subject, which is often the case, if you cite, for example, third-party research or offer a reflective view to say, well, I suppose it could be this or it could be that, or so-and-so says this about these subjects, then what you're doing there is you're sort of stepping aside from the discussion, from the dialogue, and taking what's called a third position. So mixing these things up is actually quite useful. It's even more so now that we're in this sort of lockdown situation where often we're talking to people with emails or with social media, and it's not quite so easy as sitting in front of somebody and talking to them, listening to them, and having an understanding that the message that they're going to receive is the only true value of the communication. You can talk as long as you like. If they're not hearing you, they're not understanding you, then you're not communicating. So that's the use of perceptual positions. The next part of what I was going to talk with you about is something which we call neurological levels. And this is a model that was originally created, developed by a psychologist called Gregory Bateson and taken forward by a man called Robert Dilts, who works in the NLP arena. Robert Dilts has written extensively on neurological levels, and I was very lucky to be able to study under him on the subject. And basically what it does is it creates a proposed model as to how we work as organisms, as people, but it also applies to teams, and it also applies to organizations. So we can use the neurological levels model quite well. It starts with the bottom level, which is environment, and that is where we are, what we're using, what we do, and where to do it. Is it possible to do what we want to do here, where I am now? What systems am I using? That's the sort of thing that we talk about when we talk about an environment. And we all have to live in an environment where we're using stuff. The second level is behavior, and that's the bit that people observe of how we are. What are we doing? What actions are we taking? It's the primary level of this model that impacts on other people. Next level is capabilities. What am I or they capable of doing? How do you do it? Can I do something? Do I have the skills? Or does the team have the skills, if you are thinking of it as a team concept? The next would be values and beliefs. And these are the most important bit of this model, because they are how we consider what is important, what we're doing something for, why we do something at all. Why, you know, if for example, I believe that people are basically good, that's a belief, and I will act accordingly, and I will use my behaviors to demonstrate that. The next level is what we call identity, and this is what we call, I'll use a non-proper word, belongingness, if you like. The group we're part of, the team. What are we doing things for? It's the group that we belong to. And the last level of all is purpose, and that's a spiritual reason for doing anything at all. It's the, if you like, the reason you might think, why am I here? It might be your religion, it might be I do this for God, it might be I do this for mankind, but it's the highest level of our neurological levels. They're called neurological levels because we operate at those levels in different parts of our, if you like, psychology. So how do we use this? Well, the main thing to think about here is that if you're trying to bring people together into a common purpose, like something like a project, then appeal to them perhaps at identity level and emphasize the required values. We are a team that does this. We want to do this, don't we? This is our belief. This is our it's valuable that what we're doing is right. It will produce these benefits in the project environment, and that's what we're doing it for. And then you can move down the streams, down the model to, you know, who in our team can do this, who can do that. And then at the bottom levels, you know, behavior, well, that means that we always respond to people in time. We always are polite with them, and so on and so on and so on. And that the environment is the systems we're using. Here I am sitting in my house using a laptop. I might be in the office, but that's just a difference of environment. So in order to be able to bring people together, appeal at a higher level, and the lower levels will follow. That's the important key here. If you've got something that stops people from doing something, you have to jump up a level to find out what it is that's driving that. In the 1960s, people started to think that the behavior, which they called then juvenile delinquency, was caused by just behavior. But actually someone worked out that no, it's because they believe they belong to a tribe that isn't you, and that tribe works in a certain way, in a certain way, and so they're going to behave that way. When you appeal to people at the identity level or the beliefs level, you can drive the behaviors. So how do you use this in practice? Well, going together with this particular model, neurological model, is what we call chunking up and down. And how you use this is, for example, if you want to find out what's stopping someone from doing something at a behavior level, perhaps, you have to go up the levels to find out what it is that they believe and what are their capabilities. So what stops you from doing something will take you down a level. If you, for example, say, right, what is it that stopped you from producing that report for me? Oh, well, it was the, I couldn't get onto the system. That takes you down to the environment level. Or you might say, why did, what was it that caused you to send that email to this person? Well, I thought that they weren't able to do something, so I wanted to help them. So you're moving down to capabilities there. You're actually chunking down. You're finding out what are the mechanical reasons why things do not happen. And going the other way, you can find out what it is that is important about something. So, for example, if someone behaves a certain way, you say, well, what's important about behaving that way? What is it that causes that to happen? And you move up to beliefs and identity and capabilities. So how do you use that in practice? Well, if you ask what's important about and what stops you from, you can discover what it is that empowers people or blocks them from doing something. But one tip is try not to ask, why didn't you do this? Because that can often provoke a defensive response, and people have to sort of get an entrenched position there. If you say, what stops you from doing something, it's a lot less charged than saying, why didn't you do something? The next chunk of thinking about how we're communicating in certain times is convincing people. So these are what we call convincer channels. They're not channels in the same way as Anne was describing, which is a channel strategy, the means by which you reach people. We're talking about the way in which we understand things. So convincing people, again, statistically, we're broken up into groups of people that, for example, 55% of us, when we see something, we get it. We see the answer, there it is in front of our own eyes. 30% of us will be more convinced when we're told things. Only 3% of us, when we read something, will say, now I get it. And about 12% of us will, when we've done it ourselves a few times, perhaps, then we get it. So convincer channels, really important, how people will come to believe something that you want to say to them. And they're modified by convincer modes. So convincer modes are, for example, if you're someone who, let's say, your hearing convincer channel is your primary one, then if you hear, say, 3 people say it, you're going to believe it. It might be 10 people, it might be 1 person. If you're the sort of person that needs to do something to really understand it, it may be that you have to do it 3 times or 4 times or whatever. There are some people who just get it, they're automatic. And there are some people who, when they hear 3 people say it the same way or 3 people writing it the same way, they'll get that because it's consistent. And some people just, over a period of time, they say, okay, I understand. So convincer channels, convincer modes. How do you use those in practice? Well, if you think your audience is just taking things on trust, then just communicate. If you don't, then use a mix of convincers on the basis that an audience is going to be made up of a mix of channels and modes. So think about, you put slides up for people, or whether you talk to them, or whether you write things down, or whether you get them to do something. This will help people to understand what it is that you're trying to get across. Lastly, really, in these times we're living in at the moment, it's quite difficult to understand how we could work in a verbal and non-verbal communication differentiation. As you probably have heard, there is a theory which was put about by a man called Albert Mehrabian in 1967, a proposal that if you're using language where there's an emotion involved, and by the way, most decisions involve an emotion at some point, only 7% of the message relates to the words that are spoken. 38% of the message pertains to the feelings and the way that the words are spoken, and 55% of the message is a facial expression. So not having a facial expression, if you're using email, is obviously a bit of a blow, because you don't, that component of the communication isn't there. But of course, if you're using cameras, if you're using Zoom or Skype or whatever it is, then your face is on camera. But be careful, because when we're using our cameras in this lockdown situation, do be aware that you're probably going to find that your face is in a slightly lower resolution. So, having your eyes narrowed to slits is probably going to be more obvious when you've got a camera trained on you that's not looking at you in great detail. So having a mix of all of these factors, the primary representational systems, perceptual positions, the neurological levels, and convincer channels, these are tools which, when you get the pack, you'll be able to look at them in more detail perhaps, which will help you to sort of steer your communication in the right way, to get to people, to get stuff back from people in our uncertain times at the moment. So really that's all I was going to talk to you about on the mechanics, and there are many, many more of them, believe me, but these are some of the ones that are quite important that we can bring to bear when we're talking to people, listening to people, communicating with people in these rather constrained times that we're living in. So with that, I'll really say thanks for listening, and I'll hand you back for any questions.
Anne and Tim, many, many thanks indeed for an excellent presentation and some very interesting thoughts there, and I'm sure a lot of people will take a lot away from that. On your screen now, you'll see some of the resources and links that we have coming up. One of the great things is that one of the focus groups within the People SIG is the Stakeholder Engagement Focus Group, but we do have 3 within the People SIG. We have the Stakeholder Engagement Focus Groups I've just mentioned. We also have the Communications Focus Group, which Anne and Tim are key members of, but we also have the Leadership and Behaviours Focus Group, which we're hoping that they will be putting on a webinar in the not too distant future on all of those. The latter 2 are fairly new focus groups within the People SIG. Stakeholder engagement has been going now since 2013, and we have a number of resources on the APM website, which the link is there on your resource link for you if you so wish. The question.
Dealing with ambiguity, have you got any examples where you've had to say, we don't know what's going on?
Yes, Maya, thank you for that one. I think this is very common on project and program communication, and certainly in my experience. And I can think of one example where it was sort of business as usual, so we weren't in such uncertain times as we are now, but we were establishing a large shared service centre. And this was a very long programme with about 20 odd constituent projects. And employees were very concerned and keen and interested to know where this new facility was going to be established. But we couldn't tell them because we didn't know. You know, there was a whole pile of process, your procurement, assessments, analyses you can imagine that had to be gone through before the final decision could be made. Now, obviously, some people were a bit concerned, thinking, well, you probably do know, and you're just not saying, and I want to know if it's going to be near me because I'd like to have a job there. So what we did, we would keep signposting. We would talk about the process and then talk about where we were in that process, and then people could see that we weren't just not saying it because we didn't want to, that there was a process, there was some logic and some reason behind the fact that we couldn't give an actual answer. And obviously some people would still think, well, I think you probably know anyway, but we genuinely didn't, and we genuinely had to go through a process, and I think most people got that. So it was about signposting and keeping people up to date with how you were progressing against that sort of journey that you'd set out.
Thank you very much indeed. We've had another question come in. In CERC maintenance, correcting misinformation, do either of you have any thoughts about how far one should go with this? Often different interests or sort of media can adopt a position that engenders misinformation and don't want it to be corrected.
Yes, thank you for that. This is quite a tricky one, and I think there are probably levels of it. I was quite interested to see actually that the UK government Cabinet Office has established an actual function to deal with this. I saw the other day to correct misinformation. And it's going to happen when we're working on projects and programs. You know, rumours get out there, people interpret things in different ways. So it may not be purposeful, it might be just genuine misunderstandings, and we can help address that with some of the techniques that Tim has talked about. But I think you know, I have worked in organisations where we've actually had a rebuttal unit that is there specifically to issue corrections. So I think part of this is about listening. So when we are communicating, we're getting back what people have actually understood by what we've said and done, so we can then go back and correct that. We can ask media, be it internal within our organisations or external, to correct things when they're factually incorrect. We can't always obviously guarantee that they will, but sometimes you just want something on the record. So if somebody comes to revisit that piece of information, there is something there to go, okay, well, that was later corrected. And we need to be careful though, because sometimes I think, if I put my sort of media relations hat on, different media will have different agendas and different perspectives. So, some people may see things in slightly different ways, but if it's actual factual data that's incorrect, then I think, I think we should ensure that that's corrected, if only for the record. Tim, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I think certainly one of the slides that you had, Anne, which I think I'm praising here slightly, but when something goes wrong, crisis management, or indeed in the situation which has been asked about, so if you've got to correct something, then I think your slide says something along the lines of say it fast, say it all, and say it yourself, or something like that. Basically, I couldn't agree more with that. You're doing it quickly is very important. But also, I would say here's a classic example of where perhaps the person who said it, and I can't remember which of the government spokespeople it was, but you probably remember from a few weeks ago, there was a discussion about letting the coronavirus sort of sweep through the population to build what I think they called a herd immunity. Now, a lovely term, isn't it? But what that didn't do was it didn't think about the second position, which was the people receiving that message and what might they think. And well, we know what we thought, and basically they had to reverse that position quite quickly. So thinking about the perceptual that people receive messages critical in these situations.
Thank you both very much. Have you ever had any examples that you can share about how we can convince somebody who cannot see the problem?
So I think probably the question is not literally seeing it, but perhaps understanding the problem. Tim, do you want to perhaps take that one?
Yes, if it's a problem to which the solution would be being able to see something, then obviously, I guess that the question is asked from the position that the situation we're all working in at the moment, where you can't actually show somebody something. Now, if it's something physical like a pump or something, you need someone to look at it and say, oh well, that bit's wrong there. Then obviously that's more difficult when you can't show something. But of course we've got fantastic technology available to us, and having photographs of things from different angles might be a way around that. But also I would say to think about if it's a language issue, whether you are genuinely not describing it in the way that the other person's primary representational system receives information. So if they are a visual person, as I've described, then being able to describe the situation, the issue, the object in visual terms will probably help them. I don't know if that's of any use, but it's a thought.
Thank you very much. We've had a couple of questions about obviously being virtual now at the moment. One is, do emojis in some way compensate for not having a face in terms of communication?
Oh, well, emojis, that's an area fraught with sensitivity. I have to say I'm very naive about the use of some emojis. So I tend to be very cautious, and with me it's either a smiley face or a thumbs up or a thumbs down. But I think it's really interesting, isn't it, how we're finding much more informal ways to communicate. And I'm sure Tim will have some views on this. But I think for me, it's a bit about appropriateness, thinking about who you're talking to, who the stakeholder is, how would they feel if, there was more communication coming in that format. Does it feel right for that particular stakeholder? Does it feel right for the brand that you're representing? I think tone of voice from a sort of corporate brand perspective is quite important. So not just in the way that Tim was discussing, but how does your organization like to communicate? What's its tone of voice? How does that fit with the brand? you know, I've worked in banking and telecoms. You know, I used to work for BT, for example, and some of these organisations, you know, for them to start suddenly communicating in quite a sort of funky emoji way might sit a bit oddly. So I think it can be great. It's like a bit of shorthand, isn't it? But my feeling is it has to be, you know, the right tone of voice for your organisation and the stakeholder. But Tim, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think emojis are an interesting one. I personally think they're a fine way of communicating, and you know, I use them myself, particularly when I'm getting the feedback from the other person that I'm perhaps communicating with, that they've used it as well. So that's okay. You know, so in that case, we kind of have an understanding. We can do a thumbs up, and it's okay. Obviously, one has to be careful. I think there was a situation maybe a year or so back when an emoji didn't translate between different systems. So you know, someone was doing smiley face or something that was coming up as a gun or something in the other, you know, in the other operating system. So you have to be a bit careful. But I personally find them quite useful, and I think you've really got to just try it out. You will get feedback. You really will get feedback. If you're smiley facing and thumbs upping all over the place and nothing comes back, you've got it wrong. So you know, adjust.
I think, and also Tim, I guess for those of us now using Microsoft Teams, you know, emojis are kind of inbuilt, and I think in our own little team in my company, we often try to out-GIF each other. You know, towards the end of the day, we're trying to find the wackiest GIF that we can use, but that's fine within our little team. So they are becoming a more established part of day-to-day communication for sure.
Thank you. We've had a couple more questions come in. One of them is making a plan. It's obviously very important, but in an uncertain situation when all of the stakeholders are looking for information, how do you convince the team that to do a plan first is important before filling the channels, as it were, with communication?
Sure, and I think, and this is actually something we've been discussing as a SIG group actually, that uncertainty isn't necessarily a reason not to plan. And certainly when I'm talking to the students that I work with who are studying communications, sometimes there's a little bit of, oh, you know, planning, oh, it takes forever and we just need to get on and do. But actually planning communication doesn't need to be onerous, and particularly if you've got some of the groundwork in place. So you know who your stakeholders are, and if you don't, well, you know, that's a quick session, a collaborative session to work that through. What are the channels that you're going to use to communicate? Again, you know, that can be decided and pulled together quite quickly, but it's really important, and particularly as, you know, as we've talked about in these uncertain times, you know, for your stakeholders to know how you're going to communicate with them, when you're going to communicate with them, and perhaps who the face of that communication is, who their point of contact is really important. And so the planning in this kind of scenario perhaps we're better to call it a framework. Perhaps that might be a better way to think about it. It's a bit of a light bulb moment for me there, but maybe if we think about it more as that, and then the content gets fed down that channel to the relevant stakeholder at the time that you've agreed. So all that kind of framework is set up, but then as things are changing, obviously the message and the content is going to change, but you've already sort of established that framework. So that might be a way to look at it. And I'm a great believer in having, whatever you want to call it, a plan, a framework. Just actually at the end of the day saves you so much time. Otherwise you're sort of rushing around thinking, oh gosh, you know, who do we need to tell? How do we get the message to them? When should we do it? Blah, blah, blah. But if you've done all that thinking, and that doesn't need to take a lot of time, it actually saves you a lot of time. I'm sort of feel very passionately about that. Tim, I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, just whatever works. You know, if you have a communications plan and clearly it's not hitting the target, then adjust. As I said in one of my earlier slides, you've got to be able to take account of what people are receiving. So always be ready to be flexible, I would say.
Thank you both so much. That's the end of the questions and near the end of the webinar hour.
But again, thank you again to Anne and to Tim for an excellent presentation. And above all, thank you to all of those who have attended today. I trust you've enjoyed it as much as I have, and we look forward to more of these and joining you in more of these virtual webinars as time moves on. Thank you very much indeed.